Kia ora and welcome everyone. We're really delighted to have all of you here today for this session. This is the Fulbright New Zealand Good Works Alumni Seminar for May 2022. We have our presenter today who is Dr. Tom Logan, and he's joining us from Christchurch. Dr. Logan is a lecturer in civil systems engineering at the University of Canterbury. He completed his PhD at the University of Michigan's Department of Industrial and Operations Engineering, where he focused on the intersection between risk and urban planning. Tom received a Fulbright New Zealand Science and Innovation Graduate Award in 2014, and he completed during his award his master's at Johns Hopkins University in Geography and Environmental Engineering. Tom's research and his teaching and his consulting focuses on climate change adaptation and understanding how to plan cities and communities that are more resilient, sustainable, healthy, and equitable. So today, Tom will be talking about the risks of rising sea levels in New Zealand and the indirect impacts that this will have on our built environment and our communities. He'll discuss recent research in this area and touch upon the major questions that remain for how New Zealand plans for climate change adaptation. So I will hand it over to you now, Tom, and thank you so much for joining us.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone, and thank you for coming. I can probably skip much of this, but yes, I'm at the University of Canterbury and focus really at the intersection of risk and urban science, using operations research techniques, looking at climate change mitigation and adaptation. And I was fortunate enough to get a Fulbright scholarship several years ago that took me to the University of Michigan via Johns Hopkins for a number of reasons. But it was a great experience to head overseas and to be able to come back with those connections. And so now I've been in New Zealand for the last 2.5 years, just before the COVID lockdowns, which was a function of good luck rather than good management, and work quite closely with some well-known groups around New Zealand, like Resilience to Nature's Challenges, the Deep South Challenge, a group at the University of Canterbury that focuses on community and urban resilience. But in saying that, in addition to that, I've maintained a number of international collaborators that have been possible through my exchange to the United States. So I'm sure that this is no surprise to anyone, so I won't dwell on the climate science. But as we're all well aware these days, global surface temperatures are increasing, global sea levels are increasing, and essentially the risk increases with the temperature. And I think that's a really important point, is that although we do talk about tipping points and they are important, there is a constant need to keep those temperatures down to reduce the risk from across several domains, and I'll talk about that shortly. So what do we do about this? Well, again, this is something that you're probably quite familiar with, is that we have the option, we can mitigate and we can adapt. And the classic saying is that we have to manage the unavoidable and avoid the unmanageable. So mitigation is about avoiding the unmanageable, reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, while adaptation is managing the unavoidable, essentially the impacts that we've locked in and we can't get away from. And so in that case, we have to be designing and planning and engineering solutions for the projected future. But critically, and this is where a big research challenge and also practical challenge, is that interventions can be both adaptive and mitigative, or they can both adapt and mitigate climate change. And those are the solutions and interventions that we need to be doing our best to find, to seek out and utilize. A big challenge, though, is that there is a huge amount of uncertainty. We know that climate change is happening, we know why it's happening, but we don't know what the impacts are going to look like beyond some threshold. For example, there was a few months ago a big study that came out that basically said there was unprecedented heating or unprecedented temperatures at both of the Earth's poles. Just a few weeks ago in New Zealand, for a completely different reason, we found that relative sea level was increasing much faster than we expected. And the quote here was, "Explosive new data shows that sea level rise is rising twice as fast." And if you weren't familiar with that, that was because of a recent study that was looking at land subsidence and coupling that with rising sea level. So the New Zealand is sinking while the sea is rising. And none of this is a huge surprise to us. It's just part of the uncertainty that we have to figure out how to manage. But to date, we haven't needed to been particularly good at planning under uncertainty. An excellent summary of this is the connection between our release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is to poking an angry beast with a stick. What we have to do now is that we've poked the beast is figure out exactly how we're going to manage life with said angry beast. So we have to prepare our cities and our communities, and we have to develop our infrastructure, our social and our economic systems, our governance structures, and our planning and preparedness to make everything more resilient or less vulnerable to extreme events. And that really requires system-wide change. For example, if we compare the response or the success of the response to the COVID pandemic between the US and New Zealand, we saw that one of the key factors of our success, at least initially, was trust in government and social cohesion. And so thinking more broadly than just disaster risk reduction is really important as we prepare for climate change. Recently, we've also finally seen some action from the central government on climate change legislation. The Zero Carbon Act or Climate Change Amendment Act in 2019 has required that we do a national and local climate risk assessment every 5 to 6 years with an adaptation plan which will be monitored every 2 years. And that national adaptation plan is currently out for consultation until June 3rd, I think. At the same time, the government is working on the Strategic Planning Act and the Climate Change Adaptation Act. So there's a lot going on, a lot of moving parts, but it's really important that we fit all these together if we're going to find these co-benefits. So adaptation needs to be a proactive process. And generally, the point is to understand what the hazards are that we might be facing, what is happening, identify what we care about and how those assets are at risk or their vulnerability to those hazards, figure out different interventions and pathways, implement the best ones, monitor that, and then repeat the process, updating our information as we go. So this should be a proactive process, and hopefully that's something that we will start to see sooner rather than later. And at least finally, we are starting to see that in New Zealand. But the big question is, how do we plan for coastal hazards or climate change hazards or any hazard without knowing what is exposed and how it might be affected? How do we effectively manage our assets without understanding conditions that they might experience? And how can we test and evaluate options and planning strategies? And so key part of this is understanding our risk. And so understanding our risk and what action is being taken to address that risk is going to help us to adapt. And this really has to be iterative because our risk and our information keeps changing and our understanding of the underlying processes keep changing. So we need to be able to iteratively do this, evaluate potential interventions, and be in a position that our risk assessment can inform operational decisions and strategic decisions regarding assets, land use, and other typically local decisions. The National Adaptation Plan, which I mentioned, is out for consultation at the moment. The three sort of main points of this is to reform institutions to be fit for a climate change response, to provide data, information, and guidance to enable everyone to assess and reduce their own risk, and to embed climate resilience across government strategy and policy. But one of the massive challenges here is that the plan seems to assume that councils in particular have fairly rigorous risk methodologies, capacities, and capabilities. And while some councils are building that, there are a lot of councils that aren't being provided those resources. And so that presents a massive challenge for the equity of our response, if it is, as the National Adaptation Plan appears to be doing, is placing the entire burden on local government. In New Zealand, we also, well, actually globally, that we have a big challenge with risk is because there's confusion around the concept and the definition and how we measure it. In New Zealand alone, we have major variation in how risk is defined. Comparing several different documents from local and central government, you'll find very different definitions of risk, which sounds like a semantic issue, but is not when people get very different things when they ask for a risk assessment. And that often means that councils and decision makers simply don't know what to do with the information that they're provided when they receive a risk assessment. So the International Society of Risk Analysis considers risk as the consequences and associated uncertainties in activity. And this is probably the most esoteric part of my talk, but it's worthwhile understanding what we mean. This is also a topic that I was fortunate enough to get involved with, working on some of these challenges, figuring out how we apply the concept of risk into situations where we have complex systems and societal systems. And the societal systems is what really matters when we start thinking about climate risk. I have an article in Nature Sustainability, which is embargoed until tomorrow or first thing in the morning on Friday. And another article, and these are with people from around the world who are leaders in the International Society of Risk Analysis. But essentially, the best way that you can think about risk is to imagine that you're a canoe and you're paddling down some river delta or following some currents. And there are many, many places that you can end up. And naturally, this process is occurring over time as we're paddling into the future. And some of the places that we could end up could be quite terrible, and other places could be quite fantastic. But we don't really know where it is that we will end up. The focus for us is making sure that we make the right decisions and enable, basically set ourselves up so that the likelihood of us ending up in a good place is higher than the likelihood of us ending up in a bad place. And so that's why we think about risk as the consequences of an activity and associated uncertainty. More formally, we can think about that kind of as this sort of branching tree moving in the future. We have some activity, we have some events, we have uncertain consequences. In a climate change space, we can imagine that as some development pathway, where we have events, whether there are shocks or interventions that we can apply. And what we're trying to do with our development, with our cities, is that we're trying to make the decisions that will give us the best chance of ending up with desirable consequences in the future. And part of that is that we have to build our resilience, because that enables us to be more, basically, to be more likely to end up on those desirable pathways. So while that's all relatively semantic, I'll start to give you some examples of how we're thinking about that in practice. Before I do that, there's one key challenge for us around climate risk and adaptation. And the issue here is that when we think about climate risk, we're thinking about societal risk. And our society is this hugely complex system. We have the Living Standards Framework from the New Zealand Treasury set out that we need to be thinking about the natural environment, social cohesion, the economic domain, human domain, all of which, of course, is a function or influenced by the built domain, and all of these governance institutions and our individual and collective well-beings. So when we talk about risk, and we can contrast that from thinking about risk as it was traditionally invented, which was risk to a single or engineered system. And often we understood those systems quite well. But now we're trying to apply risk in situations where there's major uncertainty around the systems and the processes and how they might be affected. How does a direct impact from a sea level rise or a coastal flooding event or an earthquake or you name it, how does that event, how does the risk and the impacts cascade from the built environment down onto the social domain, the economic, our economy, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's one of the key challenges for us, and one that we have to identify and figure out how to address if we are to be able to effectively, if we are to be able to find solutions that not only effectively address the problem by reducing the risks, but also have co-benefits and synergies. For example, can we do something that not only reduces our risk, but also reduces our emissions and mitigates climate change? So how do we assess risk as it cascades through these different domains, sectors, and services? So I'm going to introduce a couple of different projects that my team at the university is working on. And I'm going to start by talking about accessibility, and the reason for that will become apparent. But accessibility, I imagine everyone is relatively familiar with the idea of a 20 minutes or 10 minutes or a 15-minute neighborhood. Essentially, providing people urban spaces where they can easily access all of the amenities and services within a walk or a bike of 5, 10, 20 X minutes. So one of our studies, which was looking at New Zealand and US cities to say, right, how do we stack up? How do we rank? Have we designed our cities in a way that make them accessible? And how does that accessibility vary? So this is the dashboard. We've set this up so that it can be explored by anyone. So if you're interested, you can check it out at that link. And what that lets you do essentially is explore any of New Zealand's urban areas, look at your biking, walking, or driving distance or time to your nearest supermarket, primary school, healthcare provider. And this is really important, and something that the emissions reduction plan that was released last week requires that New Zealand start to think about when they design new cities and do new development. How do we promote accessibility and reduced vehicle kilometers traveled? Another project, so I'll come back to why this is important from a risk perspective and an adaptation perspective, but it is definitely important from a mitigation perspective. Another key thing is thinking about that equitably. So how does our access to essential services, or how does our risk to different hazards, how does that vary across across our communities. Is that distribution equitable, or are there differences, major differences, or systemic differences between demographic groups or between socioeconomic groups? And so some of our research partnered with the University of Colorado in Denver was to develop a way of measuring inequality in our urban systems. So now I'll tie that into what we're talking about with risk. And essentially the reason that we're thinking about this is because when we think about resilience, and you can think about that as a complement to risk, resilience needs to be about ensuring that our communities can function. And that function can be thought of as, do we have access to the services that we need, whether they are the infrastructure services like electricity and water, or services such as education, healthcare, access to food, access to your employment. Can you be accessed by emergency services? And so that was what we started to think about, which then led us to first off say, how is everyone's access before a disaster, which resulted in our study on the X-Minute City. Now we ask, how does that access change after a disaster? And so this is Christchurch, distance to supermarkets. And what we're going to do here is simulate an earthquake and tsunami event, just as an example. And so what we've seen is that the red roads here are damaged by either the tsunami or the liquefaction. This is a probabilistic scenario. And the areas in black are cut off from supermarkets. And we can explore that based on different demographics, so different ethnicities in this demonstration. But it allows us to start to identify key things. And this is an example of an indirect risk, where the direct risk is the event affecting our buildings and our roads and our infrastructure. But the indirect effect is the effect on the isolation of our communities, or the increase in travel time or distance that our communities are required to travel. And this is work that we're implementing in Wellington, looking at their earthquake scenario, but also the Christchurch City Council thinking about their climate change response. And again, that's you can check out this dashboard on our website. Moving in again even more explicitly into climate change, the question is, how does our risk from sea level rise increase? Because currently all of our risk assessment and our planning and our adaptation planning is based on direct risk from flooding. So often we talk about, when we talk about managed retreat, we frame it in terms of, will my house be flooded or not? But we know that your house can remain quite dry, but you can be cut off and isolated from essential services. And so a study that is currently under review at Nature Climate Change with one of my colleagues at the University of Maryland, we essentially looked at potential isolation for the entire coast of the United States. So, and then compared this indirect risk to the direct risk of flooding. What we found was that flood events occurred, what we found was that the indirect risk from isolation can occur decades earlier than direct exposure, and can occur in places that we didn't assume were at risk. I'll see if I can, I'll answer any questions at the end if that's all good. And this is being recorded and will be shared on YouTube. So, like I said, we found that indirect risks can actually occur decades earlier than we expect. They, in the US at least, the indirect risks were more than 3 times greater, so 300% increase in the number of people affected or at risk, and places that wouldn't have been identified as being at-risk areas from flooding became exposed. And so this is really important for when we start to think about when and where we're allocating our adaptation funding. We've started to do this study in New Zealand, and our results have just come in, but we're working through that research at the moment. And again, we're seeing an equally significant increase and an even bigger increase in the number of Maori people when we consider indirect risks. So that's allowing us to start to ask the question, how do these disruptions affect communities, and is that disruption equitable? Continuing on that idea of indirect risk is when we start to think and model our interdependent infrastructure. We've designed our cities in a way that all of our infrastructure is connected. So for us to use water or wastewater, we need electricity. This is a preliminary model of Christchurch, where we've subject Christchurch to a tsunami and modeled those outages to the different infrastructure. What we've seen is that in the blue, we can see the extent of the hazard, and in the red that isn't covered in the blue are outages that have arisen as a result of indirect impacts. So because of a failure caused by the tsunami, we can see that there are a lot of houses that have lost electricity, water supply, or wastewater. And so this type of research lets us identify homes and areas that are indirectly impacted and evaluate criticality so that we can start to identify places that need either relocating of critical infrastructure or strengthening of that infrastructure. Finally, a project in Colorado, Denver, that we've been working with a team at the University of Colorado, Denver and the US Naval Academy, is looking at how do we optimize facility locations and optimize the strengthening of this critical infrastructure. So where should we build or add another supermarket? How, if we want to achieve some level of access or some level of equitable access, how many new supermarkets or facilities should we build, and where should they be going? And finally, what order should we be reopening facilities following a disaster? So in practice, we're working really closely with the Christchurch City Council on their coastal hazards adaptation planning. And the objective of this partnership is to spatially explore scenarios or spatially explore risks under potential sea level rise scenarios, understand the criticality of assets so that we can identify priority areas, and develop an iterative and collaborative process so that we can support that risk-informed planning. Essentially, what that means is that we want to enable planners and residents to understand their risk and support them to make informed decisions about interventions, spatial planning, and asset management and maintenance. Like I said, we're thinking about the living standards framework and the wellbeing domains. So at this stage, we're looking at the built environment, the natural environment, the human domain, and the cultural domain. And the economic domain is something that will come as a result of this. So what we're putting together is a risk explorer that will support the council and be used as part of their community engagement. This is about a few months away from being completed and signed off, but essentially it'll enable the council to understand their risks, what that means, and critically evaluate different interventions. What it looks like is something along these lines. This shows the estuary in Christchurch and shows roads that are vulnerable from these flood events, so medium, high vulnerability, and will allow us to not just think about long-term planning, but also asset maintenance and management. And what that means that we can do is then start to estimate the social and cultural impacts that could occur as a result of these impacts, whether it's isolation or subsequent anxiety and other mental health issues. As an aside, we know that in New Zealand, we lose approximately $160 million annually as a result of anxiety-reduced leave from work. And so that is likely to increase if we're not managing our retreat from these areas appropriately. And what we're trying to, what our real ultimate goal here is to support an integrated planning approach. So the Strategic Planning Act, which is proposed, essentially has provided a laundry list of objectives and outcomes that the government wants future planning to consider, from sustainability to resilience to risk reduction. And so how do we actually do that in practice? And so some of our research has been looking at how do we guide future development? How do we make sure we avoid maladaptation? So simply relocating from one place to another place that has high risk or other detrimental outcomes. How do we consider sustainability, accessibility, and risk? These four maps show that what Christchurch, where you should think about building in Christchurch, if on the far left you just think about retreat from the coast. The second to the left, if you think just about retreat from the coast and think about avoiding other known hazards. The second from the right, retreat from the coast, but also trying to build cities that are accessible and will therefore have low emissions. Or on the far right, where are the key places that we should be building that achieve all of these objectives? And so this is just an example with a selection of objectives to see how this will work and how it can be put into practice. And this is something that we're working with some councils to see if this can be useful. So a last comment and a big concern for New Zealand and around the world is a reflection on a study in 2018, which was talking about disaster-driven response to climate change. And this paper that was published in Nature Climate talked about this idea of salience, or being noticeable. And what Sarah and her team said was that risk of disasters can motivate planning. So the risk can motivate planning, but it's the occurrence of a disaster that can lead to action. So events that raise the salience of risk will make people and governments more likely to pay attention to that risk, act on that risk, or demand action from others, regardless of whether such actions actually reduce risk. And that's something that we need to be really careful as we move into this new phase of climate change, where we start to actually see the impacts, is that the actions that we take are actually going to be effective. And not only that, they need to not only be effective for risk reduction, but they also need to be effective at increasing our sustainability, lowering our emissions, and achieving some of our other societal goals. For example, here are some examples in wildfire and flooding where there are inefficient responses and maladaptive responses. And a maladaptive response is one that unintentionally increases the risk or other negative outcomes. So in New Zealand, some of our key challenges is going to be balancing insurance and equity and liability, and we've seen that in the National Adaptation Plan, which is doing attempting essentially to shift liability from one place to another. We need to think about and we need to make sure that we're managing our risk and taking early responses rather than ad hoc responses. We need to accept that managed retreat is that retreat from the coast is going to occur, and that we need to manage that. And again, the National Adaptation Plan is failing to do that. It's managed retreat does not look, managed retreat is not achieved by simply telling residents that one day they'll have to leave and they have to deal with it. Managed retreat needs to be more about, needs to have more of a shared responsibility. We need to be careful about greenfield development and further sprawl as we attempt to exit areas that are at risk from natural hazards, as we saw in Christchurch with the significant greenfield development following the earthquakes. And we need to avoid tech fix distractions like we're seeing in the emission reduction plan, with a huge focus on electric vehicles. Which is not to say that they won't be part of the solution, but they certainly are not going to be the full solution. So one of the key things that we have to make sure that we do is engage with the local councils and central government as they're engaging and doing consultation on their various plans. So thank you very much. I will finish there and welcome any questions or comments. But you're also welcome to email me afterwards.
Thanks so much, Tom. Yeah, just to mention, everyone, if you don't want to ask a question right now, you can feel free to type it into the chat. Tom can read it and respond there. I also just wanted to say thanks so much. It was a fascinating presentation, really sobering as well. I did have a very quick question for you, but in terms of urgency, you covered a lot of material, and there's a lot of things that need to be looked at foundationally before any sort of major changes seem to be able to happen. And that sounds like it would take a long time. What's your sense of urgency in this work?
Yeah, well, basically, I don't tend to take weekends off. But more seriously, we have to make decisions based on the information that we have at hand. And so, for better or for worse, so our research has to start addressing some of these key challenges, but equally, we need to be trying to make the best of what we do know and make sure that our adaptation is, well, as we describe it technically, as being dynamic and adaptive. So make sure that the interventions that we take don't lock us into a single scenario, but that we can adapt as the information and as our understanding improves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Okay. Any questions here? Oh, here we go. There's a question in the chat. Can you see that, Tom?
Yep.
Great.
So Karen's question is, you mentioned in your work, in your Christchurch example, about analysing vulnerability. What sort of work are you doing in that space? Vulnerability is a function, well, it changes depending on what domain we're thinking. In the built environment or in built infrastructure, vulnerability is a function of, or basically is asking the question, if I have some asset and it's exposed to some amount of hazard or some severity of a hazard, how much damage might I expect? And so a lot of that is based on data that's been gathered post previous disasters. In the social and natural contexts, vulnerability tends to be estimated based on sensitivity to the hazard and adaptive capacity. So, for example, if a wetland is exposed to increasing sea level, does it have the ability to move itself or to change as a result? And so that is like, understanding both of those is really, really key for us. It's a key part of risk because the vulnerability informs what the consequences are. And so in Christchurch, where where possible, we're using existing existing understanding on vulnerability, but we're also having to develop vulnerability estimates where that information doesn't exist. And so we're working closely with subject matter experts to develop estimations or estimates of that. So hopefully that answers your question, Karen.
Kia ora, Tom. Hi, my name's Angela Sutherland. I work for Porirua City Council in the climate response team. I was just interested in what you were saying about different approaches to measuring risk and understanding risk, because you might be aware that in the Wellington region, we're undertaking a regional risk assessment at the moment, led by Becca and Niwa. And I'm just wondering, and Judy Lawrence and Elan Noy are also on that leadership group. I'm just wondering, I'm assuming this is something that other regions are likely to be doing over the coming months, if they're not already, and I know some regions have done it already, but just interested in your comment. Obviously, the approaches are going to be somewhat different. Would you be advocating for using the same methodology for each region, or do you feel like there is some room for, I guess, nuances in the methodology based on the region of the country that we're looking at?
I think there needs to be nuance, 100%. I think, though, we need to provide more guidance to, I think while nuance is good, we need to not expect all of the councils to develop their own methods for assessing risk, because that can be quite advanced. And while the Wellington consortium of councils is excellent, other councils might find themselves with fewer resources to do that. The big challenge with the ministry's guidance for local climate risk assessment is that it says that assessing risk spatially is optional and assessing indirect risk is optional. And what that will leave you with is a risk assessment that basically doesn't tell you what to do about those risks. And that's the big challenge that we're doing our best to communicate to the ministry about. But it's something that I've talked to Jamuna and some of the others in the Wellington region. So I have a lot of respect for some of the members of the team that you guys have brought on board. But I think one of the big challenges is making sure that the output is actually usable for what you're wanting it for. One of the challenges with the national risk assessment was that the national climate risk assessment was they recognized the importance of interdependence and interconnectedness, but also recognized that they didn't incorporate it as well as they thought was necessary. And so that's what we're trying to do in Christchurch, is to improve that understanding so that we can provide councillors more operational information. Yeah. But
great, thank you.
To chat about that with you, yeah, offline if you
sure.
have.
Thank you. No, that's great, and I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
So you might see, Tom, that there's another question in the chat.
Yes, I saw it come up and then I forgot about it. So the question is, the results that you showed for Christchurch City, how flexible is it to apply a similar model to other regions to assess the risk? relatively flexible. What we want to avoid is an idea that we can take some software and apply it to any region and it'll give you an answer. Because as Angela pointed out, there is nuance between the different regions. There's different communities have different risk tolerances or value different things, or their vulnerability might be different. So what we're trying to develop is methods and approaches that can be applied more broadly, but will require support from, well, within reason, support from people that are experts in the space or who can look at it and translate it into a lens that's appropriate. Robert's question, the X-minute neighborhood slide is great, thank you. Is it fair to say that some countries like Aotearoa and Z, where fossil fuels are a smaller part of the economy, can focus on adaptation, whereas other countries like the US must focus on both mitigation and adaptation? Okay, great. Great political question. Incidentally, that was in part the kind of the information that we were getting from the national-led government about 10 years ago. Well, not quite that long, saying that we're a really small player in the climate emission space. So therefore, well, actually, I think what they missed was therefore we need to prepare for the changes that we really don't have much of a say in what's going to happen. And it was unfortunate that we didn't start thinking like that back then. However, I understand that. I think, yes, there's not a huge, essentially we're going to be at the mercy of what a lot of other countries around the world do in terms of mitigation. We also need to mitigate, and we can do that either because we feel like reducing our own emissions is important in terms of contribution, or so that we make sure that we aren't relying on those fossil fuels when supply chains are disrupted or when the fuel prices increases. So designing our cities has, in those kind of ways, has benefits for other issues beyond mitigation. Another key factor is that studies have shown that cities that are more accessible and denser or more compact, and all of this is caveated on that it has to be density done well, which New Zealand is only just starting to think about. Density done well has benefits for social cohesion, for health and mental and physical health, and all of those things matter for our adaptation planning. So all of those things have benefits that make them worthwhile thinking about. The question is really aimed at my home country of America, where we need to not get distracted by yes, 100%. So, and of course, then the next distraction is geoengineering, which is another huge kettle of fish that comes with a lot of sort of moral hazards. But yes, I would say that the US especially, and other large countries, I think globally, every country needs to focus both on mitigation and adaptation and try and find solutions that have co-benefits and synergies.
Just a quick note as well, Tom, that we had another Fulbright alumni Good Weeks seminar like this a couple of months ago with Sarah Nelson, who was talking about that tech reliance, and how there is this sort of, I mean, I didn't understand the science, obviously, but just the general gist was that we do tend to think that tech will save us, you know, that there'll be some kind of fix. And because of that, our focus has shifted away from what we can actually do ourselves as individuals and as communities. And it was really interesting and really mind-blowing for me as well, because it's like you say, these are tech distractions. You know, they do make you think that there will be some sort of silver bullet here. But yeah, it's a important thing, I think, to discuss too. But thank you for bringing that up.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. I definitely think that while technology can help, it's going to need to be coupled with some major sort of structural and behavioural changes, which COVID has shown that we can do.
Yeah.
But I think for engineers, especially for civil engineers and for geographers and planners, we need to understand the role of the built environment in these and start designing our cities in a way that makes living sustainably not a hard choice, but the obvious choice. Make it the easiest thing that we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And that really does come down to city planning, to decision making.
Yeah. I see we've got one more question there, and we might leave it at that as our last question from Kate Turner. So I'll let you answer that, and then we will look at wrapping up.
Cool. Okay, thank you. So Kate's question, with your results that you're saying Māori communities having increased in exposure to indirect risk, to what extent do you think that climate adaptation sense is also about improving our response to totality, obligations, and action on equity, related to the framing of climate change being an exacerbator of existing inequalities? Yes, it's really, really important. I think one of the key reasons why we need to be thinking about indirect risks is in part to better reflect our partnership. Te ao Māori perspectives recognise that interconnection and that holistic nature of well-being, and without the tools to assess these indirect risks, we're not able to reflect that in our risk assessments and therefore our decision making. And so in Christchurch, we're working quite closely with the hapu and the runanga to co-develop some of these strategies so that we can make sure that cultural values and Māori values and risk to Māori culture and practice and tikanga can be considered by decision makers who have in the past only had information about the direct risk on the built environment, so therefore would be unable to properly reflect it. But equally, providing information that's useful for hapu and runanga to make decisions. So I'm not sure I've entirely answered your question, but it is such that essentially is a large motivator for us to make sure that the decisions that we're making, whether it's improving our cities and the accessibility of our cities, or reducing the risk, or supporting different places, captures and understands existing inequalities so that they're not further exacerbated or further institutionalized. Yeah. But yes, if anyone has any other questions, please flick me an email. I'm more than happy to hear from you. And I think we'll wrap up. So thank you very much for listening and for attending and for some great questions.
Thanks.